Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, Dave, thanks so much for meeting with me. It's really great to meet you. And just wanted to have a little bit of time to get to know you a little bit. I'll be sharing this with people in our Sangha,
Cool.
and you'll be teaching with us next year.
Very excited.
So, yeah. Um, so tell me, just to start, tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, your history.
Sure. Sure. I'm a rare animal in the sense that, I'm a younger teacher. I'll be 49 next month. And I started teaching, I started practicing the Dharma when I was 18. So I'm from Massachusetts, and I grew up in Western Massachusetts near the Insight Meditation Society, which probably most people are familiar with. Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, kind of the beginning of all this insight, mindfulness, Vipassana world, which is kind of the world that I operate in to some degree. And I also had the good fortune of growing up down the street. My grandmother lived down the street from Daniel Goleman in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. So I grew up basically with his children. His son, both of his sons are good friends of mine, but one of them in particular were really good friends. We still are. And so I was always, I'd go to his house in the summertime, and, Ram Dass would be there, and Joseph would come over. And I mean, I grew up blue collar, Boston. My dad's a Vietnam vet, very blue collar. My dad was a bricklayer. I didn't grow up anywhere near that world. And so when we moved to Western Mass, it was, very affluent, very college educated, kind of a world that I wasn't that familiar with. And, I had a lot of trauma in my early life, a lot of just kind of catastrophic loss. My sister was killed in a car accident. I've been through kind of like, here today, gone tomorrow, in a family system that was very supportive, but didn't have any skills or tools on how to really deal with that kind of stuff. So I was pretty screwed up by the time I was 18, and being around Danny and his family and the extended family there, they kind of suggested that I go talk to a Dharma teacher. I had no idea what that meant, and I was like, yeah, fine, I'll go talk to your friend, And so
Uh-huh.
I met this teacher, Stephen Smith, who I really still identify as my primary teacher, who lives in Asia, has for a long time. And I just started practicing Vipassana, mindfulness. It was interesting. Like I always say, this is kind of funny. Like in the early 90s, if you sat a Vipassana retreat at IMS, you could sit a 10-day retreat and maybe not even hear the word mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So that it kind of grew out of that. So that's my background. So I've been doing this for a long time. I started teaching about 15 years ago. And I'm also in recovery. So I definitely identify as somebody who's recovered from, complex trauma, which also part of that with addiction, drug addiction, alcoholism. And I've been sober for 20 years. And so I spent a lot of time in my teaching career. I worked in youth detention centers, drug and alcohol treatment centers. I ran a lot of programs in Tennessee for the Davidson County Sheriff's Office, the Tennessee State Prison for Women. So I started teaching meditation in rooms where the suffering was like at a very high volume, which I think is the best training you can get. Now you go to
Yeah.
these retreats and it's a bunch of like nice, white, polite people sitting quietly in the hall. But when you walk into the prison and there's like 65 people like who don't even want to be in there, so that was the best training. And so, now I live out here in Western Colorado. I have for about 7 years. Um, I wear a lot of different hats. I definitely identify from a Dharma Buddhist perspective and kind of the Theravada lineage, insight lineage, but more nowadays what I call early Buddhism. So most of my teaching, really all of my teaching, frankly, is rooted in the Pali Canon. That's really kind of my primary focus. I'm kind of a Pali scholar nerd, and I've worked with teachers like Stephen Batchelor is a teacher I've worked with for about 10 years now. And I work with him closely. We've developed some programs. John Peacock, these English kind of academic guys, and so I teach. I teach at Vallecitos. I'll teach at your place. I teach at Southern Dharma. I teach at some of the Insight places. But I'm also very like we have an organization. We can talk about this later if you like. Secular Dharma Foundation. And actually, a lot of that was inspired by the readings I've done with David Loy, some of his books around looking at how do we, I feel very rooted in a Buddhist tradition, and I think it's important to be rooted in a tradition, but I don't want to feel stuck in the tradition. So I'm kind of navigating that world of how do we respect where these teachings come from, and at the same time, how do we also respect that there's been lots of contributions made to human flourishing through mental health, through science of emotions, through Western psychological training? Like we know a lot of stuff now that the Buddha didn't know. And so I think there's a way, and that's kind of the paradox and the tension that I hold now in my life and my practice is blending these two worlds together, which to me is a secular move of really just trying to, I just trying to help people, and anything that helps people's good. So that's kind of what I'm up to now. I love teaching retreats. I love to, a lot of the retreats we're doing now are nature focused. So I'm excited to come out to your spot. But that's the longer story short. If you want me to unpack more of it, I'm happy to. But that's kind of my location these days.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I have a lot of curiosity about all of it actually. So
Yeah, right. Me
it's
too.
such a great story, like
It is
where you
actually. It
come
is.
from and like your childhood and um yeah, it sounds like there has been some yeah, real trauma too. So
Yep.
that's yeah.
Which is, a common tale. I mean, I find that people come to the Buddhist path or come to the Dharma, this kind of thinking, philosophical thinking, contemplative training, usually, not always, but often from a place of kind of suffering and woundedness. People don't usually run into the Dharma holics because everything's been fabulous.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And did you so the you used to teach in prisons.
I did.
And so when you taught in prisons, were you working with like addiction recovery and the Dharma? Was that sort of the domain or
Yeah, sometimes. So there was a number of venues I went through. So the first program I ran that I really was a very sophisticated program that I think was one of the best programs I've ever seen was actually in the jail in Nashville, Tennessee. It was a program developed by the Davidson County Sheriff's Department, and it was a clinical driven program, and it was cognitive behavioral therapy was their overarching, that was their intervention. And so as part of CBT, they wanted there to be a mindfulness component, but it was Nashville, Tennessee. It was 2005. They couldn't find anybody. So, this woman, I forget how we got connected, but the woman who ran that program got in touch with me and said, "Will you come and teach the mindfulness?" And so I was like, "Yeah, sure." But I didn't know what I was, at that point I was just starting. I didn't really know how to deal with, what is it, MBSR? Is it Buddha Dharma? Is it, I didn't really I hadn't developed a lexicon of terminology to talk about it in a meaningful way. So I kind of went a little bit too clinical and a little bit too dry, and it wasn't working.
Mhm.
People couldn't sit. There was a lot of outbursts. It was just like I couldn't get people to meditate for 2 minutes. It was just,
Mm.
and these were women who selected, they wanted to be in the program. It wasn't like, so I always had a rule. I wouldn't do programs that were mandated. The people who were in the room meditating had to have chosen to be in there. That's very important, actually. And
Mhm.
so I went back to the clinician and I said, I don't think this is going to work. I said, I think I need to do stuff that's more of a Buddhist nature. And I said, I don't know if that's going to be a problem, because this is the deep South and, the B word. And she was like, I don't care. She's like, these people are in jail. She's like, nobody's watching. She's like, whatever you think is going to work, just do it. The lady was super
Mhm.
cool. And she was like a corrections officer from Utah. She was
Mhm.
married to a state police officer. She was very Christian, very
Uh-huh.
right
Uh-huh.
wing, but she was a
Uh-huh.
total humanitarian. She was like,
Uh-huh.
whatever will help these people. So we started doing like
Mhm.
metta practice, loving kindness and compassion and
Mhm.
forgiveness. And when we started to do mindfulness practices that had a stronger heart base, the intervention became a lot more manageable. So once people had a
Mhm.
tiny bit of kindness for themselves, then they could do mindfulness for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes. So that was a big eye opener for me. And that was kind of where I started to push back or kind of be confused about, like, secular mindfulness is good, but you know, it's too cognitive heavy. So that was when I started to use emotional intelligence language. The jail wasn't so bad, but in certain places you go to, it's really interesting. Like, certain places get upset if you use certain kinds of terminology. So that was
Mhm.
one of the things I had to deal with right away. I was like, okay, what words can I use in this building versus this building? Of course, the higher end it was, you go to these higher end treatment centers, and they're like, no, you cannot say Buddha. don't even, you can't say, and so, and I'm like, oh, so I always had to like, be kind of what I would call stealth Dharma, where I'd
Uh-huh.
have to have conversations like what, because for me, I was like, it's all the same.
Right.
But it was a very interesting training to have to go through that and be in Nashville, Tennessee in the mid 2000s where there was nobody. I was kind of a lone wolf. Nobody was doing this stuff. I was really just making it up as I went along.
Mm. Wow.
It was really exciting, actually.
That yeah, it sounds really, really cool. It um makes me, curious about clearly your work as a Dharma teacher, it has an activist component to it, you
I
know,
think so.
and I'm curious about how that lives for you. Like
I'm really
what
happy to hear you say that. I've never actually thought of myself as an activist. And so
Mhm,
it's really interesting to hear you say that because it is true. I was an activist. I worked for Greenpeace in the early 90s. So I've always had an environmental, so I've always been kind of I've kind of always just been a punk rocker too. I've always been
mhm,
I like that. And so, yeah, active, I would say like in many ways, I don't work in it so much because working in the addiction world, incarceration is one thing, but the addiction world, I got compassion fatigue syndrome twice. I
mhm,
mean,
mhm,
it's a dark place. It's a dark world. The suffering is overwhelming.
mhm,
What our society does, uh, I mean, the way that we deal with addiction, like a lot of things in our society, unfortunately, is pathetic. I mean,
mhm,
like if you're a drug addict in America, you're more likely to go to prison
mhm,
than you are to treatment.
mhm,
And ironically, it costs more money to put somebody in prison than it does to give them actual treatment. So the
mhm,
access, that was where I would get really angry. The access,
mhm,
you have these really, really rich white people who are going to these $40,000 a month treatment centers. They've been to 25 of them. So I was teaching in those places on a Tuesday. And then
mhm,
Wednesday morning, I'm back in the prison. And
uh-huh,
it's like, it was interesting. The suffering was the same.
mhm,
The people in the prison weren't doing any worse than the people at the
mhm,
$40,000 a month treatment center. Like the suffering was like, you know, that's one thing that's interesting about dukkha, right?
mhm.
The humanness of the dukkha, the human experience. It's like suffering is suffering.
Hmm. Yeah.
That was an interesting thing. So as an activist, kind of, I have been. I also think and believe that the interventions that we provide for people with substance abuse is not very good. The addiction treatment world is just the money and the social and the insurance and all that stuff. I don't want to go too far down this road because I will get angry. Is it's just really
Mhm,
like it's bad. And so, I actually have a couple programs that I've developed in that way. So and so from an activist point of view, it's like really like I had to be sneaky.
mhm, mhm,
I had to be really, really clever about like, okay, what can I say here? What do I tell the people above? What do I tell them that I'm doing? Because people are smart, especially people who had a strong Christian conviction would get angry and they would go it doesn't take very long on Google to realize that mindfulness is a Buddhist meditation practice.
mhm.
Do you know what I mean? Like you don't have to
Right.
dig
Yeah.
very far.
Yeah.
And then people come back to go, this guy is teaching Buddhism. And it was like
Yeah.
the other thing that this is one of the things that I really love about the recovery world, and I really thank and respect the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step world, is I think really the one contribution to addiction that actually has value and teeth and it's really helped a lot of people. And that the interesting thing about that doorway is because the 12 steps place a lot of emphasis on higher power, a lot of
Mhm,
emphasis on meditation, a lot
mhm.
of emphasis on spirituality, a lot of emphasis on God as you understand him. Because spirituality has been recognized as a viable component for recovery, then you can sneak the Buddhism through that door because you just
Yeah.
say, well, it's just another
Right.
kind of spirituality. And
They
so,
kind of already laid the path out.
yeah, so all of a sudden you go into these addiction trees, like, yeah, you can say Buddhism, you can say, well, the spirituality world, and of course I have mixed feelings about that world, but because spirituality is such a gigantic concept, it gave me permission to go in there and throw all the Buddha Dharma at him I wanted to, because I could just say, well, this is just a different kind of spirituality. So
Right.
that's an interesting phenomenon.
Uh-huh.
Now you
do
go
you
into a public school and try to pull that. No, 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 no.
no. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Do you continue to do anything around addiction and as a Dharma teacher now?
I mean, I don't, but I would. It's
Hmm.
a lot of, I have a mentoring program with about 50 students or so in it. And so like probably half of my student roster, the people that I work with one-on-one and haven't worked on
Hmm.
with one-on-one, are in recovery. But,
Hmm.
these are people who've been sober 10, 15, 20. They're
Hmm.
very high functioning. They're very
Uh-huh.
happy, well-adjusted people. So basically, I'm still working recovery, but the people I work with are like they're much further down the trail.
Yeah.
I do actually have a program that I've designed, that I've developed, that has been used, called Mindfulness East, which stands for Mindfulness Emotional Awareness Skills Training.
Hmm.
Kind of a clever title,
Yeah.
Mindfulness East. And so what that is, that's an emotional intelligence curriculum that is really heavy on the emotion side, but uses mindfulness and the heart practices as kind of the contemplative side of it. There's a couple programs in the country that have used that, um, but it's a great program. It's just kind of sitting. It's one of these things. It's like I don't really have. Somebody would email me today and wanted me to come train their staff to do it. I would do it in a second, but it's been hard to break. It's hard to break into that world.
Mm.
So I've kind of just gotten. So I
Mm.
would. I just don't get a lot. And the pandemic really screwed everything up, actually, because
Mm.
I used to do a lot of. I would fly. I'd go to. So I would go sometimes to a big treatment center, and I would train their staff. It's about a 16-hour training, and I would
Mm.
train their staff, and then they would use it. But that has kind of gone away for the most part, unfortunately.
Mm. Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it's ready to go anytime someone wants to use it. You know.
Yeah. That's very cool. What in terms of the kind of Dharma that you're teaching now and what you'd be teaching at what you will be teaching at our center, what can people expect? Can you give us a little bit of
Yeah, sure.
a window into
So when I do Dharma retreats, there's a range of ways that I teach. So sometimes I'll teach what's called the progress of insight, which is the Burmese Mahasi Sayadaw method of Vipassana. But I teach it a little bit differently. I teach what's called Metta Vipassana. So we teach
Mhm.
basically a combination of the four Brahma Viharas with the four foundations of mindfulness, kind of through the system of Mahasi Sayadaw, which is pretty elaborate system. Going through the progress of insight. That starts with sila, that starts with ethics, transforming behavior, which a lot of people are doing that anyway. Developing the mind, developing the heart, and then insight practices. Day 4, day 5, where people can really start to identify some of the more afflictive or destructive forces in the mind. So when we teach a Metta Vipassana retreat, sometimes we'll use that system, which I think is really quite good. I just did a
Mhm.
retreat for the mentoring program in Big Bear in California. So I
Mhm.
teach that problem. I teach the Metta Vipassana retreat probably 2 or 3 times a year. I'll probably
Mhm.
always teach it. I think it's really, my opinion generally is that when it comes to kind of the Theravada school of training, the Burmese lineage have the best systems from what I've gathered. The Mahasi Sayadaw system, Progressive Insight, Sayadaw U Pandita. I mean, those guys really, it's a pretty well tested system, right?
Uh-huh.
We're like Ajahn Chah and the Thai Forest system. I like that practice, but there's not a lot of theory or philosophy behind it. It's just kind of sitting and noticing. And the other thing that I teach that's actually interesting, which I will be teaching this year at Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma, is what's called the Tejaniya, Sayadaw Tejaniya system, which is generally called natural awareness, which is actually quite different, even though they're both Burmese systems. His teacher Shui Yumin, it's really like we won't even probably use the word concentration once. It's a very
Mhm.
open awareness, which is great in nature. It's very opening to sensory awareness, sound, sight, smells, taste, colors.
Mhm.
It's a very, very open, very, very big
Mhm.
awareness,
Mhm.
mindfulness, with some heart qualities in there. When we teach that retreat, the schedule is very loose. So we don't do, like if I do the Mahasi retreat, it's usually like, you get up, sit, walk, very structured schedule, 45-minute sits, very kind of, like you would see at an IMS or a Spirit Rock, a very kind of tight container. where
Mhm.
the Tajanier retreat, there's no schedule. It's like there's teaching sessions. There's teaching sessions in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and some nature practice. But people kind of come and go on their own. They're just kind of, so it's a little bit, people need to have a little bit more experience to do that. Not always, I shouldn't say that that's always the case, but they're not as contained tightly. And in many ways that they're both, you know, Theravada school. They're very much Burmese style, but they're just different systems.
Mhm.
Um, Systems that I both have practiced and utilized, and I think there's value in both of them. So those are the two. When I teach Dharma retreats, I'm usually teaching one or the other of those programs. Now, this is just to remind folks, because I got an email from Kathy, I got to respond. You know, this retreat is a rental, so we're not actually. This
Mhm.
retreat won't be open to the public.
Oh, okay. Aha, that's great. Thank you. I hadn't
So yes, this retreat
realized
is
that.
for my
Yeah.
mentoring program. I might open it if I don't fill it, but I mean,
Mhm.
I have, you know, I have 52 students. I'll probably invite 70 people to sign up. And what do you guys are going to be at 20, 22 with some camping? It's probably going to be full, right?
Yeah, we fill up really full at 30, but generally 20, somewhere between 25 and 27 is the sort of the comfortable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that so we're probably shooting for that. I'm probably shooting for about 20, and I suspect I'll just fill it with
Mhm.
my people. But in the
Yeah.
future, you know, I'm like I said, I will also say this because I really mean this. What I'm
Mhm.
what I value more than anything else is long-term relationships. You know, like that's really
Mhm.
what I'm looking for
Mhm.
with different places. Like I have a long-term relationship with Vallecitos. I mean, once in a
Mhm.
while I'll get invited to go somewhere and do something and do a kind of a one-off. I'm not very interested in that. You know, I'm interested in facilities, programs, retreat centers that have a similar view as I do, a similar ethical view. And my goal is to just kind of develop and deepen a relationship over time. And the fact that you guys are in Colorado and I don't have to jump on an airplane, and you know, I like, you know, everything I've heard. I know Peter now, so I feel like this is kind of a no-brainer. But
Yeah.
I'm really curious to see how this unfolds.
Well, it sounds like at some point in the future, if we can get you scheduled for an open retreat, we could probably um get a lot of people for it. So
Yeah, no,
it'd
I would
be.
love to do that. Maybe 2025 because I
Mhm.
do. You know, me and my wife have been doing this a long time, so we're good at like we have our own registration system, and if I'm only inviting my students, we can do the admin stuff, do a rental. We're going to do Donna for
Mhm.
this one because you guys
Mhm.
give us a better rate, which I really respect that you guys
Mhm.
do that. Frankly,
Mhm.
I really respect your ethical framework from what I've seen.
Mhm.
um and so, but I don't really like doing that. So if we do a retreat in 2025 and I just come and teach it and you guys do the registration and all that, and that's definitely my preference. But the first time
Mhm.
out of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
gate, you know, and we do the mentoring retreat annually anyway. So I do a retreat once a year just
Mhm.
for my students. We did it at Big Bear last year. We're doing it
Mhm.
here this year. We kind of move around a little bit. So, but I would be very, very interested to talk to you guys about doing a longer
Mhm. Mhm.
and all these different practices. I like I said, I don't hold. I This hasn't always been true for me, but I'm very suspicious, and I try to be very mindful about not clinging to a methodology.
Mhm.
Which, if you've been in the
Yeah.
Dharma world, I'm sure you know there's a problem that you know this method, this teacher, this style is the best.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
really don't like that kind of thinking. I think there's many systems within Buddhism, and they're all and you know they're just different. They have different emphasis. Some people emphasize concentration more. There's a lot of different ways of emphasizing, and I just really am suspicious of trying to pin down the best true one method. I think that that's a um, you know, a very kind of what's the word? Just a kind of naive way to approach the whole thing.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, I'd love to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Um, and I tend to try and keep it a little bit short so that it's not, too intimidating if somebody looks at the timestamp on the video.
Yeah, yeah, no, I
Um,
get it. Yeah.
um, but so you had sort of started talking about how the specific teachings, the Dharma teachings that you're teaching kind of interface with teaching in nature, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is something that's kind of new for me.
Mhm.
I sat a nature retreat. I actually sat Mark Coleman's Awake in the Wild at Vallecitos this summer. My
Mhm.
wife sat there as well. Um, so there's a couple ways. So we teach what's called secular Dharma, but also there's another movement that very much mimics secular Dharma, which they call naturalistic Dharma. And so just kind of go back and look. So if we think about the Buddha, right? The Buddha was sitting in the woods.
Mhm.
They were sitting in nature. The Buddha didn't use the word meditation. He uses the word cultivation. That's the word that he uses, bhavana,
Mhm.
sati bhavana, metta bhavana, dana. All the things that we cultivate in Buddhism are all bhavanas. They're cultivations. And
Mhm.
so he's also very guided by the concept of seed and fruit. So my
Mhm.
general position is that what the Buddha woke up to was he saw how things performed in the natural world. There's
Mhm.
seeds
Mhm.
and then there's fruits. And if you
Mhm.
tend to the seed, you get the fruit. And there's interdependence and there's system theories. And,
Mhm.
and, and it seems clear to me that what he did, he said, well, I wonder if that same theory actually operates for the mind.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think it does. And I think this is a brilliant way to think about it. So, being in nature, first of all, the clinical research, I mean, the research around being in nature is just good for you, period.
Mhm. Yeah.
Even if you're not doing any Buddhist meditation, just being in the woods by yourself without your phone, without your distractions is just good for you anyway.
Yeah.
Let's just put that in here. But I think that there's a correlation. I think when people start to see being in nature and cultivating the mind and seeing the relationship between the exterior world and the interior world creates what Tejaniya calls a natural awareness, that
Mhm.
nibbana, we talk about this
Mhm.
goal, nibbana, nirvana.
Mhm.
Nibbana is just actually a natural element of the universe
Mhm.
that we can attune
Mhm.
to, that we can open our senses. And people don't realize this, maybe they do, but like the Buddha talks a lot in the early discourses, a lot, and even the teachings on mindfulness about sensory awareness. And where better to explore sensory awareness, in the top of Estes Park, you know what I mean? Like,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
so I think that, and so
Yeah.
when I teach at a place like Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma, my tendency, and at this point, just what feels obvious to me, like I probably wouldn't teach the Mahasi system there, just because, not because it's bad or wrong, but because like, you know, look where you guys are. Like the natural
Mhm.
awareness system seems like kind of a no brainer. So
Yeah.
I think the correlation between the natural world, the causality of the natural world, the interdependence of the natural world, the fact that like, the planet did make us.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. We
you know,
belong whether we realize it or
I
not.
mean, whether however you hold that, I think most
Mhm.
practitioners have value science. So I see
Mhm.
it that is and I would emphasize that in our nature retreat, and
Mhm.
we would actually do practice on the land, which I did with Peter, and Peter's really brilliant at navigating this stuff actually. And so going out for 2 or 3 hours and sitting and walking as a group and just being, and
Mhm.
so in many ways the land of Eco Dharma is the teacher.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have you up there with students, and
I'm
I
sure
feel
everything I'm
very much the
saying is
same
like
way.
stuff that you guys have thought about a million
Yeah.
times anyway, right? I mean, that's why you have places like this. That's why,
Mhm.
your center's not in downtown Denver.
Right. Yeah. 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 And what you're saying about, sort of the roots, the core of Buddhism really, really being coming from nature is, very feels like a really deep part of Dharma teachings, Dharma practice. And, I
I think
don't think
so.
it's a
I'm moving that way more now. I mean, I think it's just, I think it's almost a bit obvious.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much. It's really great to meet you. And thank you so much for being willing to speak a little bit. And
Oh, my pleasure. Also, I think you sent me an email. I just want to get in my calendar.
Mhm.
I think are you guys having some retreat in May that I'm invited to? Is there what's going on
Yes.
with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Let me write
yeah,
that.
let's,
You want to set the recording off?
yeah, let's do that.